We're now days away from the Iowa caucuses, yet each day seems to bring more than the usual amount of political drama during a primary season that is definitely shaping up to be an election year like few others. We're going to talk about that with my first guest, Katrina vanden Heuvel. She is editor and publisher of The Nation. She also writes a weekly column for The Washington Post. She joins me from New York. Your magazine has just endorsed Bernie Sanders for president. How big a consensus of that was of the editorial board?
Well, The Nation is not a monolith. Our national affairs correspondent, Joan Walsh, has a piece up just now at thenation.com. Go check it out about why she supports Hillary Clinton. But our resounding editorial in support of Bernie Sanders, someone The Nation has covered for close on to 30 years and covered his ideas, which finally are getting a hearing in the mainstream in this country. We believe that his insurgent campaign of principle, of integrity, is raising the issues this country desperately needs to hear: the staggering inequality of power, the rigged system that is keeping people out of opportunity. We believe that in this time, Bernie Sanders is the candidate who is best able to speak to what is possible in this country, and his issues are in sync with the vast majority of people: Medicare for all, affordable college, expanding Social Security, a living wage. So, Larry, The Nation, for the third time in its 150-year history, endorsed in a presidential primary. And we did so as we look out at the extraordinary enthusiasm and passion Bernie Sanders is generating in this country as we head to Iowa and New Hampshire and witness the surge among young people, among independents, and among many who have followed The Nation for decades.
Katrina, if he didn't use the word socialist, would he even have more of an impact?
You know, in many ways, Larry, it's a good question. Bernie Sanders is essentially an unreconstructed 21st century New Dealer. He echoes Franklin Delano Roosevelt in so many ways. I thought of that the other day when he said, the strength of a nation isn't measured by how many billionaires we have, but how we take care of the most vulnerable among us. That is so Rooseveltian. But he's also a social democrat. And as many of your viewers know, essentially that's in the mainstream of Europe and other countries. So I think socialist is a tough label for many. But what's so interesting, Larry, is how many millions of people in this extraordinary election have looked beyond the labels and like what they hear. And I think that's critical.
Are you surprised at how well he's doing?
I will admit that a year ago, it was April, at the end of April when Bernie Sanders announced, people didn't know. What they did know, and in our editorial we also write of this, we're living in a movement moment, Larry, a movement of the fight for 15 minimum wage, Black Lives Matter, climate justice, dreamers, reproductive rights. And I think in Bernie Sanders, those movements have found a champion lifting up their voice. It's a time of extraordinary passion and anger, Larry. Almost a decade after the greatest financial crisis since the Depression, many people haven't seen their lives really repaired. And into that moves a Bernie Sanders. It could have been an Elizabeth Warren. As you know, there was a draft Elizabeth Warren campaign, the senator from Massachusetts, the great populist champion. So I think there was room for a candidate like Bernie Sanders, and he took the chance. He had the courage to go up against one of the most powerful political machines in this country, the Clintons. And so we're witnessing the strength of that passion.
Katrina, I want to play a portion of a video from a Sanders rally this weekend. Get your reaction. Bernie asked the crowd in Iowa if anyone had experience living on $12,000 a year on Social Security.
I've been living on probably less than that for a long time because of disabilities. And it's so hard to do anything to pay your bills. You're ashamed all the time.
It is not easy for people to stand up and say that. But the truth is that until millions of people who are experiencing exactly what you guys are experiencing do say that, we don't make change. So I thank you for saying and for telling us what's going on in your lives, because the truth is, you can't make it on 12,000. You can't live in dignity on 10,000 or less. And millions of people today are in that position.
Katrina, you wrote that many pundits are saying the choice between Hillary and Bernie is one between the head and the heart. That's a pretty good description of this race. Can the heart win?
Listen, Larry, what you just played is so important. We don't see that on mainstream television, the pain that millions of people are feeling around this country. I think in Bernie Sanders, you saw the great empathy. He has traveled around this country, but in his own state in Vermont for years, speaking to poor people, to working class people, listening to their stories, telling them that he supports the need for jobs, for lives with dignity. So I think this is a moment, Larry, we've overused the term, but this is an anti-establishment moment. This is a moment when what we've witnessed over these last years is that the serial devastations wrought to this country have been brought about by the responsible establishment candidates. I think it's time to listen to those who propose an alternative to what has been the status quo. And in Bernie Sanders, you do have a candidate who has a strategy for change, and I would argue whose policies are in sync with the majority of the American people and are common sense. So vote for the heart. I'd say vote for the realist. He looks out at the world and understands, you know, after the wilding of Wall Street, unleashed by deregulation, it's time to tame these banks, wrest power back from the big pharmaceuticals, try building on Obamacare for universal health care, and engage the world in a less hawkish way. I think that's realism in our time.
Okay, let's get to gut politics. Let's say Bernie wins Iowa. Let's say Bernie wins New Hampshire. When you look at the national polls, though, once it goes down South Carolina, Virginia, Nevada, Hillary is a clear favorite, isn't she?
So, you know, there's a lot of talk about South Carolina being Secretary of State Clinton's firewall. The polls are moving there, too. She is obviously the leader there now because of the Clintons' long relationship with the African-American community. But Bernie Sanders is making some inroads, Larry, and to talk, as you said, gut politics. Nothing changes momentum like success. No one has voted yet, though we've been talking about this election for many moons. So let's see what happens in Iowa and New Hampshire. Nevada's an interesting state, Latino, a lot of labor unions. The labor leadership has often gone with the Clintons, but the base of the labor movement is looking at Sanders carefully. So, you know, Super Tuesday brings some other states, too, which are more favorable to Bernie Sanders. This could go on for a while. What we haven't talked about, Larry, Bernie Sanders has unleashed an extraordinary fundraising tsunami of small donations. The average donation is $27. He has a lot more to work with there. And I think it's a strength that he brings this sense of being unmortgaged, the ability to fight back at the powers that be. And he can go a long way because he has that fundraising machine.
All right, there's never been a year like this, Katrina. I'm sure you'll agree with this. Let's say Bernie wins the nomination and Trump or Cruz is the Republican nominee and Bloomberg gets in. Doesn't that elect Trump or Cruz?
Well, first of all, Larry, I think it's worth noting that in matchups, Bernie Sanders is beating a Republican, Trump or Cruz. He's winning among independents versus Hillary Clinton, which is very important. You know, I don't know about Mayor Bloomberg. I think he's toyed with getting in before. Who knows? This is an extraordinary race. It gives me vertigo. 2008 was pretty extraordinary in its own way, but never say never. I mean, you're witnessing all kinds of assumptions shattered. Whatever the establishment means anymore is fractured, if not shattered. And I think it's an important opening. And our endorsement raises this at the end. Whatever happens with Bernie Sanders' campaign, Larry, his campaign has opened up the space for a more powerful progressive movement and has changed for millions of people what politics means and what is possible. So the fight needs to go on, whatever happens with Bernie Sanders' campaign. I cannot speak for what goes on inside the Republican Party. I think they're going to have a come to the wilderness moment, come to Jesus moment, because they're going to need to think about what kind of party they're going to be in the 21st century when the demography of this country is changing, their base is ever narrower, and they may be cemented, tethered to a nativism and bigotry that isn't going to serve them well with a younger generation.
Many newspapers endorse in both primaries. In fact, most newspapers, if they endorse, make suggestions in both primaries. Are you going to suggest in the Republican primary?
That hasn't been our role, but we certainly cover the Republican primaries and campaign and the larger issues about Republicans, the future of the Republican Party, the future of conservatism, I think is a fascinating one and one we've engaged, Larry. But it's interesting, the first big endorsement, the Des Moines Register, as you know, was Marco Rubio. So we'll see where that heads.
All right. Putting it this way, knowing of your feelings and who you obviously are going to vote for Sanders, and you'd vote for Hillary if she wins the nomination.
Yes, and our editorial is very clear that we consider Secretary of State Clinton not only a candidate of grit, of intelligence, who has been moved and responded to the populist temper of this time. Of course, to have a first woman breaks the ultimate, glass ceiling. She's been very strong on a great number of issues, particularly women's rights, on voting rights, but has been moved, I think, by the importance which the nation called for a year ago of a contested primary. Larry, remember, it was all about inevitability. I think a candidate gets stronger if there's a real contest, and even more important, the clash of ideas is so vital.
Everyone said it would be good for Hillary if she had a rival. I didn't think she expected it to be this good for her.
I know.
From an American standpoint, and as an American citizen, what Republican would appeal to you in a sense that you could say, boy, if he or she is president, I could live with that?
I don't know, Larry.
Nobody?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think my problem with the Republican field is it's really so extremist. It's so extremist that it's very tough for me to pick someone.
John Kasich?
He gets a good rap. It's, as someone once said about the philosopher John Locke, I know, I'm sorry to pull this one, but he towers because of the barrenness of the landscape around him. So, Bloomberg should just jump in on the Republican side. I do think it's a tragedy that this country, we need two parties, political parties. At the moment, the Republican Party is so extremist, it's not functioning as the big tent, in a sense, political party. I'm for more political parties if our electoral reform process system would open up. But I can't speak to the Republican field. I think it's a fascinating moment, though, as you said earlier, Larry, to witness a Republican Party upended by Donald Trump. What isn't fascinating, and we've talked about this, Larry, is I think the media in this country, much of the media, has done a great disservice to the people. Last summer, it was wall-to-wall Donald Trump. I mean, he is a reality show operating as a presidential candidate, and it ignored Bernie Sanders' huge rallies at its own peril. And now look at Donald Trump saying he's not going to participate in the Fox debate. I mean, he's whiny and kind of scared in doing that, but he can control his own destiny because the media has made him a kind of Frankenstein.
Katrina, thanks so much. We'll be talking to you a lot throughout the year.
Thank you.
Katrina vanden Heuvel, the editor and publisher of The Nation, writes weekly for The Washington Post. The Nation endorsed Bernie Sanders.